Hello listeners, and welcome to the 5th program in our series, Let's Learn Life Science, which is produced for grade 8 learners and anybody else who has an interest in the subject. My name is Genre, and today we'll learn about a scientific process. The process involves many aspects, so today our focus will only be on stating the aim or question of an investigation. Please have a pen and notebook ready so that you can make notes of the important points. At the end of this program, you should be able to outline that investigations are ways to find new information, explore the world around us, develop new ideas to explain the world around us, and to check the results of other scientists. Explain the steps of scientific method as choosing the right question or aim of the investigation, making a guess on the outcome of the results, a hypothesis, planning how to collect information or data. Describe how to make a test fair by identifying an appropriate control. Identify dependent, what is measured, and independent variables, what you are changing. Listeners, today I'm joined by Dr. Jerome, who has completed his doctorate in medicine in Russia, but is currently a physics teacher. A fellow colleague, Ms. Vizemba, is also with us in the studio. Welcome to today's program.
Thank you.
Dr. Jerome, I know that in your field of study, doing research and experimenting to find answers to questions are essential. Could you please share with us what the process of carrying out investigations in science entails?
Thank you. Yes, the world we live in is constantly changing. Therefore, new information is constantly discovered. Thus, the ways in which we find new information is what is regarded as investigations in science, for example. Let's say that grade 8 learners in a class are planning to celebrate their birthdays on a monthly basis. They will need to know whether there are learners in the class that have certain food preferences because of their health issues or condition they might be suffering from. This information will help them to draw up a monthly budget and shopping list so that no learners' needs are excluded.
That's a great example. Since the learners don't know each other well, this is new information they will need in order to cater for every learner's needs, which can be useful for future planning.
Yes. Do you know that investigation also gives us an opportunity to explore and develop new ideas to explain the world around us and to check the results of other scientists?
Yes, it does. Just to add to what was already mentioned, we continually study the things noticed in the world around us. In so doing, we end up discovering new knowledge and build on our already existing knowledge.
That is so true, Ms. Vizemba. Things keep changing, and as a result, we also need to keep on reading to update and upgrade ourselves. You can never say that you know it all in science.
That is the reality in science. Asking questions always help us find answers. The attempt to find answers to new questions that arise daily forces us to carry out either experiments or investigations.
And scientific knowledge is based on evidence that supports an idea about the answer to a question. To obtain reliable evidence on which we can base scientific knowledge, we follow a systematic approach that involves a number of defined steps. This is called the scientific method.
Ms. Vizemba, you mentioned there are defined steps. What are these steps?
Well, the first 3 steps are 1. Ask a question. A question usually follows from an observation. A good example can be, why is my temperature always different after lunch? 2. State a hypothesis. A hypothesis is a testable idea about what the answer to the question might be. With regard to my first question, I can answer that it's because I always drink cold Coke. And 3. Plan an investigation. Gathering information that will help us understand an event or occurrence. Since I answered based on my experience, I have to back up my answer with an investigation. The findings or outcome of the investigation will determine whether I can accept my hypothesis or reject it.
Nicely said and straight to the point. Jerome, do you want to add anything to what Vizemba said?
Of course. The fourth step is to perform the investigation. When you perform an investigation, you have to work carefully and record all the results accurately. Once the results are collected, it must be interpreted. That's the step. Interpreting the result of investigation means that you try to understand what the result shows about the question you ask. The final step in the scientific method is to draw conclusion. The conclusion is a summary of what the investigation showed about the hypothesis you stated at the beginning.
These steps always work in any investigation. That is the standard. Even in the academic world, they use the same steps. It must start with a problem, then there are factors to be studied.
And those factors are called the dependent and independent variables. Variables are the factors that will change during the investigation. Vary means change. We have to state clearly which variables are dependent and which ones are independent.
I can relate to these variables. I remember the variables are always shown in graphs. When sketching the graph of the outcome, the dependent variables are plotted on the y-axis, while the independent variables are plotted on the x-axis.
Yes, an independent variable is a factor that does not change or remain constant as a result of another factor. Independent variables are known at the beginning of the investigation. It can stand alone, meaning it is not changed by the other variable or variables being studied. A dependent variable is a factor that changes as a result of another factor. It depends on other factors. A dependent variable is measured in an investigation. Learners, I think the following tip might help you a lot. An easy way to remember or not to confuse the dependent and independent variables is to insert the names of the two variables you are using in the sentence I will give you just now in the way that makes the most sense. Then you can figure out which is the independent variables and which is the dependent variables. Here is the sentence. Independent variables causes a change in dependent variables. And it's not possible that dependent variables could cause a change in independent variable.
I think it sounds a bit confusing. Let's look at one example and thereafter we can test the sentence idea Dr. Jerome gave us. What do you think? Let's take the rate at which your heartbeat is influenced by things such as exercise, anger, or danger as an example. Let's investigate the effect of exercise on heartbeat, which is the pulse rate.
Cool. Jerome, in the example that Vizemba gave us, which is the dependent variable and which is the independent variable?
Okay, let's see. But before we can answer the question, let's quickly address other issues that come into play now. When we exercise, we normally do it over a specific time period, right? So this would mean we have to measure and record the person's heart rate, which is pulse rate, before the exercise starts. Secondly, we have to decide on a specific time period we will use to keep reading once the exercise has started. We can decide on 5-minute intervals, for example. We will also have to measure and record the heartbeat rate, which is the pulse rate, after exercise stopped and after allowing time for the person to recover. This will be the final measurement in such an experiment.
You're correct, Jerome. I noticed that you're very specific about the time intervals. Why is that important?
Experiments or investigations must have a control. These are factors that can define the conditions of an experiment. To set up a fair test or an experiment, only one independent variable may be changed at a time to determine the effect on the dependent variable. However, to be sure that what you observe really is the result of a change in the independent variable, you have to introduce a control in the experiment.
Just to add more to what Jerome mentioned, the control is important to ensure that the result you obtain is due to the change in the independent variable and nothing else. You have to keep the experimental conditions the same every time you change the independent variable. This limits the possibility of doubt about what caused a certain outcome.
Now that we clear that, let's go back to our example of investigating the effect of exercise on the heartbeat rate. The two factors involved are the heartbeat rate and exercise. Exercise is measured in a specific period of time, the 5-minute intervals we suggested. Therefore, exercise is the independent variable and the heartbeat rate is dependent variable.
Another type of control relates to doing a parallel experiment in which you do not introduce the independent variable but still measure the dependent variable. This gives you something to compare your results to and so helps to determine whether the independent variable really caused the result of the investigation. We call this the control experiment.
Wow, time flies when you're having fun. What an amazing session we had this morning. Figuring out which is the dependent and independent variable has always been a nightmare for me personally, but I totally understand it now. Before I recap, let's quickly test the sentence that Dr. Jerome gave us earlier. Independent variable causes a change in dependent variable, and it isn't possible that dependent variable could cause a change in independent variable. Therefore, exercise, the independent variable, causes a change in heart rate or pulse rate, dependent variable, and it isn't possible that heart rate, dependent variable, could cause a change in exercise, independent variable. Wow, it totally works. Thank you, Dr. Jerome, for that awesome tip. Now I can illustrate that I truly understand it by summarizing today's discussion for you. We learned that asking questions always helps us find answers, and this leads to carrying out either experiments or investigations. To obtain reliable evidence on which we can base scientific knowledge, we follow a systematic approach that involves a number of defined steps. This is called the scientific method. The scientific method steps are: ask a question. A question usually follows from an observation. State a hypothesis. A hypothesis is a testable idea about what the answer to the question might be. Plan an investigation. Gather information that will help you to understand an event. Perform the investigation. When you perform an investigation, you have to work carefully and record all the results accurately. Interpret the results of the investigation. Interpretation of the results of an investigation means that you try to understand what the results show about the question you asked. Draw a conclusion. The conclusion is a summary of what the investigation showed about the hypothesis you stated at the beginning. We also defined variables as the factors that will change during the investigation. Vary means to change. If a factor is likely to change because of a change to another factor, it is called a dependent variable. If the change in a factor is not the result of a change in another factor, it is called an independent variable. An independent variable is a factor that does not change as a result of another factor. Independent variables are known at the beginning of an investigation. A dependent variable is a factor that changes as a result of another factor. A dependent variable is measured in an investigation. Controls are factors that define the conditions of an experiment. To set up a fair test, only one independent variable may be changed at a time to determine the effect on the dependent variable. However, to be sure that what you observe really is the result of a change in the independent variable, you have to introduce a control in the experiment. Another type of control relates to doing a parallel experiment in which you do not introduce the independent variable, but still measure the dependent variable. And of course, we won't just leave you without a question. Here's your question for today. Define the following terms: A, hypothesis, and B, independent variable. This program was written by Shiwa Kambata. Take care.
This program was brought to you by NAMCOL with funding from the Ministry of Education, Arts and Culture and the Commonwealth of Learning.